This is the third class of our course, and today we'll be looking at some of the teachings of Ibn Sina or Avicenna. We'll do that for this meeting and also for the next class meeting as well. Both will be on Avicenna. So we proceed. Avicenna was born in 980 and died in 1037, and he is the most influential and certainly most important of all the philosophers of the classical Islamic rationalist tradition. And so we proceed. As you see on this slide and the next slide, I provide some bibliographical information for you. Jules Janssens has the best bibliography on the work of Ibn Sina or Avicenna as well. And I call your attention to the Bibliography of Islamic Philosophy by Hans Dieber, together with its supplement from 2007. In addition to that, we have the ongoing bibliographies of Islamic philosophy and theology by Thérèse-Anne Drouhart of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. in the United States. Special mention is reserved here for several books that are really quite valuable for this course. The first I mention here is Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes on Intellect, their cosmologies and theories of the active intellect and theories of human intellect. This is by Herbert Davidson from 1992. It still remains a very valuable book. Perhaps even more important for our purposes, though, is Davidson's 1987 book, Proofs for Eternity, Creation, and the Existence of God in Medieval Islamic and Jewish Philosophy. Davidson's particularly good on these difficult matters, but these are difficult matters. In addition to that, I recommend Dimitri Goutas's work, Avicenna and the Aristotelian Tradition. And also in the metaphysical matters, Avicenna's Metaphysics in Context by Robert Wisnowski from Cornell University Press in 2003. Finally, we have a new volume available from Oxford University Press, a general book on Avicenna by John McGuinness. This is quite a valuable text and certainly a very good introduction to some of the complex issues involved in the study of Avicenna. Our goal for today's class and also the next class is to understand Avicenna and his contribution to the conception of creation in the thought of Aquinas. For this, I go back to the text from the Commentary on the Sentences, which I cited at the end of our first class. That first class when we discussed vocabulary of creation in the Quran and in the religious context of Islam. And this is the very same text, but I go over it again because it sets the context for the discussion of Avicenna. The claim that I'm making is that the foundations for the discussion that we see here in Aquinas in his Commentary on the Sentences, on Book 2 of the Sentences, does very substantially come from the discussions of Avicenna, which we will go over today and also the next class. So, I quote Avicenna. The notion of creation, I quote Aquinas. The notion of creation involves two things. The first is that it presupposes nothing in the thing which is said to be created. Creation is said to be from nothing because there is nothing which pre-exists creation as uncreated. The second is that the thing which is said to be created, non-being, is prior to being, not by a priority of time or duration, but by a priority of nature in such a way that if the created thing is left to itself, non-being would result. For it has being only from the influence of a superior cause. Precisely those two notions are found in Avicenna, as we shall see. I continue then with the quotation of Aquinas from the Commentary on the Sentences. Quote, for those two reasons, creation is said to be from nothing in two ways. One is such that the negation would negate the order of creation in regard to something pre-existing implied by the preposition from, ex. So that creation would be said to be from nothing because it is not from something pre-existing. That is with respect to the first. Aquinas continues, the other is such that the order of creation in regard to nothing pre-existing would remain affirmed by nature, so that creation would be said to be from nothing because the thing created naturally has non-being prior to being. And I emphasize this next part. If these two suffice for the notion of creation, then creation can be demonstrated in this way, and in this way the philosophers have asserted creation. And again, Aquinas has Avicenna in mind here, among others. Finally, to conclude the translation of Aquinas' text, quote, "However, if we take a third consideration to be required for the notion of creation, so that in duration the thing created has non-being before being, so that it is said to be from nothing because it is temporally after nothing, creation cannot be demonstrated in this way, nor is this conceded by the philosophers, but is supposed by faith. I think we'll find in some of the readings from Avicenna, the latter part of today, and perhaps also the following time we meet in 2 weeks, we'll find that in fact the doctrine of Avicenna is contrary to that of the Christian teaching. It'll be interesting to have a good look at that. Before we proceed, let me indicate some of the vocabulary that's relevant here for the study of Avicenna, the philosophical vocabulary. The Arabic term wujud corresponds most often to the use of the term esse in Latin, meaning being or existence. It comes from the Arabic term wajada, which means to find something. It can also mean to perceive something. Here, something is being found. The thing found is a mawjud, which is an ens, an existing thing, a being, and sometimes it can be used as being absolutely considered. Ania is usually rendered in Latin esse, or sometimes by ens, and it means being. It's related to the notion of anna, that, and ia-ness, and so that it is-ness, perhaps, in some sense. Huia, another word for being, esse, or ens in Latin, it comes from the Arabic hua, which means this thing, and ia, so ness in that sense. And so it's a kind of thisness. But in the context, it's used sometimes to render ta'on, the Greek ta'on, and to that extent it corresponds with ens, sometimes also corresponds with esse. Another term is mahia. This is the quidditas, or the quiddity. Literally, mahia is translated as quidditas, so whatness. And it can also be used to denominate the essence of something. In English, we would say then quiddity, essence, or whatness of a thing. Wajib al-wujud is the technical term used for God as the necessary being for Avicenna, rendered in Latin as the necesse esse. Al-fa'il al-awwal is the first agent. And in this case, the first agent is God. So agens primum. And he also uses wahib as-suwar, datur formarum, the giver of forms, and this denominates the agent intellect. One more page of vocabulary. Al-aql fa'al is the intellectus agens, or intelligentsia agens, another term for the agent intellect. Al-aql al-hayulani is the material intellect, that is intellectus materialis, and sometimes this is described also by possible intellect, or intellectus possibilis by Aquinas and Albert, and others of the Latin tradition. The term matna is translated as intentio. That is an intention, and it usually refers to, but not always, but usually refers to a form as apprehended by perception or by intellect. So they can speak, in the Arabic we can speak of sensible intentions or intellectual intentions. And finally, mawjudat. This is the plural of mawjud, and so it's beings. We find it as entia, sometimes existentia. The latter is rare as a singular noun, even in Aquinas. Usually existentia refers to a plurality of things, so that the plural of the neuter existens, denoting existing things. Esse is sometimes rendered by modern translators as existence, of course. These would be then existing things. So for today's 2 lectures on Avicenna, I want to first focus on his notion of necessity and possibility, with particular emphasis on his development of the notion of the wajib al-wujud, the necessary being, the necesse esse, that is, God as the first and only necessary being. The argument which leads to the necessary being begins in Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 5, and continues through Chapter 7. 5 is on the existent, mawjud, thing, shay, and necessary, al-durari. There Avicenna writes that there are three first intentions which arise initially in the soul, that is, being or existent, mawjud, thing, shay, and necessary, daruri. These are primary intentions or notions which arise naturally in the mind as first principles. So they are, in that sense, a priori when we encounter the world. These are first principles even prior to the division of being into the potential and the actual. So for Avicenna, these are the first notions grasped by the mind in the consideration of reality in any of its forms. Avicenna writes, and I quote him here then, "The ideas of the existent, the thing, and the necessary are impressed in the soul in a primary way. This impression does not require better known things to bring it about. This is similar to what obtains in the category of assent, where there are primary principles found to be true in themselves, causing in turn assent to the truths of other propositions. If the expression denoting them does not occur to the mind, or is not understood, then it would be impossible to know whatever is known through them." Avicenna then continues, "This is so even though the informative act striving to bring them to mind or to explain what expressions indicate them is not engaged in an effort to impart knowledge not already present in the natural intelligence, but is merely drawing attention to, explaining what the speaker intends and upholds. This may occur through things which in themselves are less evident than things intended to be made known, but which, for some cause or some expression, have become better known." In this slide, for those of you interested, I provide the Latin that corresponds precisely to the passage we just looked at. I won't read it here now, but if you'd like to study it further, it's available for you. The Latin is from the critical edition of Simone van Riet. Avicenna then continues in the passage we're focused on here to explain this notion of this a priori, these three notions that are primary concepts by the human mind. He says, quote, "Similarly, in conceptual matters, there are things which are principles for conception that are conceived in themselves. If one desires to indicate them, such indication would not in reality constitute making an unknown thing known, but would merely consist in drawing attention to them or bringing them to mind through the use of a name or a sign which in itself may be less known than the principles, but which for some cause or circumstance happens to be more obvious in its signification. In other words, the soul has to be shown this, and it can be called to our attention, but it's not that something new is being placed into our understanding of reality, that is, into the mind in some fashion." He continues in the translation then, "If then such a sign is used, the soul is awakened to the fact that such a meaning is being brought to mind, in the sense that it is the intended meaning and not another, without the sign in reality having given any knowledge of it." Close quote. So the sign itself that brings us to mind is not the knowledge itself, but rather it calls attention to what is already there in a prior way. We become aware of these notions, these primary notions in the mind. Hence, according to Avicenna then, the things that have the highest claim to be conceived in themselves are these common to all matters, as for example the existent, the one thing, and others. For this reason, none of these things can be shown by a proof totally devoid of circularity or by the exposition of better known things. These then are fundamental realities that we immediately apprehend. In paragraph 9 of chapter 5, Avicenna then continues to explain this further. The thing, or its equivalent, may be used in all languages to indicate some other meaning. For to everything there is a reality by virtue of which it is what it is. Thus the triangle has a reality in that it is a triangle, and whiteness has a reality in that it is whiteness. It is that which we should perhaps call proper existence, not intending by this the meaning given to affirmative existence. For the expression existence is also used to denote many meanings, one of which is the reality a thing happens to have. Thus, the reality a thing happens to have is, as it were, its proper existence. He then continues in explaining this. To resume, we say, it is evident that each thing has a reality proper to it, namely its quiddity. It is known that the reality proper to each thing is something other than the existence that corresponds to what is affirmed. Now, to understand Avicenna here, we have to realize that the things exist in reality, in the mind or soul, and absolutely, in these three different ways. This absolute existence is a consideration of the essences of things, independent of whether they exist in the mind or in reality. And Avicenna talks about this, as we'll see in his Isagoge. In chapter 2 of Avicenna's Isagoge, he asserts that quiddities may exist in reality or in concept. They have three aspects, he says, which are exactly the ones we just saw him refer to. First, quiddity without relation to modes of existence as such. And he calls this mutlakon, or absolute, a kind of absolute consideration of quiddity. The second, quiddity as present in a particular external reality, which has accidents such as time and the like. So this is a particular existence, a particular existing thing as well. And third, there is quiddity as a conception of the mind, with the accidents of predication such as universality, particularity, and the like. As a result for Avicenna, then, no apprehended quiddity or essence has of its very nature existence. Rather, it's open to various sorts of existence. This is what makes knowledge of the world possible, since if quiddities or essences were all singular, there would be no knowledge, since knowledge is of universals only. And if quiddities or essences were never singular, but always only of universals, there would be no knowledge of particular things. So the variability of quiddity, the ability of the quiddity or essence to be both particular and also universal in the mind, that makes knowledge possible for human beings. Like the theologians of the atomistic Kalam, Avicenna holds that essences require determination from something outside the essence itself. That determination specifies the reality of that existence, existing being, as a particular in the world or as a universal in the mind. Being, then, can be said to attach to the essence to give it existence, either existence of a being in the mind or existence of a being as a particular in the natural world. Let's return then to the first book of the Metaphysics. It's a consideration of essences which gives rise in chapter 5 to the discussion of the necessary, possible, and the impossible in Avicenna. The impossible is what is necessarily not existent. It's impossible in its own right, such as a square triangle. The possible is what is such that it is only possible that it exists, not necessary. Since there are things in existence, these things are either necessary or possible in themselves. If possible in themselves, they require something to necessitate their existence. In this manner, Avicenna argues that there must be a necessary being ultimately, which is not necessitated by another, but is necessary in itself. Notice then, with regard to the possibles here, Avicenna is insisting that in the very existence of possible things, then there is an openness to existence, but not something necessitated. The necessitation of possibles has to come from outside. Avicenna establishes the existence or nature of the necessary existent in chapter 6, where he distinguishes between the possible and the necessary. Possible existence, then, as I already indicated, requires something to cause or necessitate their existence. In themselves, they remain merely possible. Avicenna then goes on to show that all the possible existence must receive their actuality as necessitated existence from what is itself a necessary existent. The necessary existent then is necessary in itself and not because of some other existent on which it depends. It is not dependent upon something outside of itself, but rather is itself the necessary existent. At the beginning of chapter 6, Avicenna describes what he's doing in chapter 6 as follows: on commencing a discourse on the necessary existent and the possible existent, that the necessary existent has no cause, that the possible existent is caused, that the necessary existent has no equivalent in existence and is not dependent in existence on another thing. Regarding the necessary existent, then, it is by definition not in need of another cause, whereas by definition the possible existent is in need of another cause to be realized as a necessitated possible. Instantiation of the possible in existence means that it has been necessitated by something else so that it exists. In paragraph 5 of that chapter, then, Avicenna writes the following: hence it is clear that whatever exists after non-existence has been specified with something possible other than itself. The case is the same with non-existence. This is because the thing's quiddity is either sufficient for the specification or not. What Avicenna has in mind here is that when we consider quiddities and the possibilities for quiddities, the issue can come up about whether we can have a quiddity which cannot possibly be instantiated in the world. The sense, then, of an example such as a square circle. Is that something that we can properly conceive, or is it already impossible in itself? Is it a quiddity that can receive existence? Is it a possible in that sense? No, because it's already contradictory within itself. So it's not a quiddity which is able to receive existence. Avicenna goes on: if its quiddity is sufficient for either of the two senses of affairs, namely existence or non-existence, to obtain, then that thing would be in itself of a necessary quiddity when the thing has been supposed not to be necessary in itself. That is, it would be necessitated by something outside of it. He goes on, and this is contradictory if, on the other hand, the existence of its quiddity is not sufficient for specifying the possible with existence, the latter being rather something whose existence is added to it, then its existence would be necessarily due to some other thing. And in paragraph 6, he writes, quote, we thus say, the possible in itself must become necessary through a cause and with respect to it. For if it were not necessary, then with the existence of the cause and with respect to it, it would still be possible. It would then be possible for it to exist or not to exist, being specified with neither of the two states. In what remains of interest in the first book, then I focus for the most part on chapter 7. In chapter 7, Avicenna reasons very carefully to the view that there is only one necessary existent. The earlier reasoning had established that there must be a necessary existent, but it did not exclude the idea that there could be many necessary existents. That is, a plurality of necessary beings. This would be similar to the view of Aristotle himself, that there is a plurality of gods as pure forms and pure actualities causing the eternal motions of the universe. But it's here in chapter 7 that Avicenna argues that there must be only one necessary existent. I will not go through that here in detail, because this might be a particularly good topic for a course paper, so I leave that for now. We'll take a pause here for a few minutes, and then we'll begin the second of these lectures.